Yeah, no one. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll give it another few minutes, maybe 2 minutes for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, thanks for joining, everyone. We'll get started since an hour goes by pretty quickly, and that way, I know it's getting late, but happy Earth Day. This is being recorded so that we can post it on our YouTube page and be able to share it out. If you have, I'm sure we're all experts at Zoom by now, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop that into the Q&A or the chat. Keep this pretty casual to have this kind of roundtable conversation on climate action in Alameda County. My name is Emily Alvarez, and I'm a program manager with StopWaste. I work primarily on our energy efficiency and climate action programs. And who is StopWaste? We're a countywide public agency in Alameda County. We are a joint powers authority that is made up of the 17 what we call member agencies. That's the 14 cities in Alameda County, the unincorporated county, and 2 sanitary districts. Our mission is to reduce waste, as our name implies. That started with solid waste, but now includes reducing energy and water waste, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions throughout Alameda County. Again, I work, as I said before, I work on our built environment team, largely on energy education and rebate programs, and I help support our member agencies with their climate action plans, which is mostly what we'll be talking about today. So Alameda County jurisdictions have set ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals that align with the state's first target of reducing to 1990 emissions levels by 2020, and now have new goals for 2030 and beyond. However, while the current climate emergency means we must act to reduce carbon emissions fast, we also are expanding climate action to mean the creation of a more equitable and thriving world. So a world where there's access to healthy and local foods, one where our homes are comfortable, healthy, and have lower utility bills, and one where we honor the highest and best use of our resources. So this is actually a photo of the Altamont Pass. So that's what the wind farm is in the background and someone laying down compost on this rangeland to see if that can help us sequester more carbon. So beyond greenhouse gas emissions, Alameda County cities and the general population are realizing more and more that climate is connected to everything. Climate action must be centered in equity and environmental justice, correcting harms to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities who have bared the brunt of climate impacts while contributing the least to this crisis. Our economy cannot be healthy and resilient without addressing the real cost of climate inaction. We've seen during the pandemic that communities face multiple vulnerabilities and that public health will suffer from air pollution, wildfires, smoke, and more if climate change is not addressed seriously. Several cities and the state have committed to carbon neutrality by 2045, which is not achievable through low-hanging fruit and acknowledges the deep systemic changes that need to occur in order to meet our goals. Sea levels are rising and temperatures are increasing. Many of our cities are addressing how we adapt to this new climate, in addition to figuring out ways to mitigate and slow down climate change. We're also acknowledging that climate impacts come from more than how much energy we use in our homes or what kind of car we drive, but go further upstream as to how we eat, what we purchase, and how our buildings are built, even if those impacts are not directly produced within the cities that we live in. So this is a big task, but there is power in addressing the interconnectedness of these issues. To quote a recent article from Time magazine called Climate is Everything, the approach affords us the opportunity to be more than just greenhouse gas accountants. We can tackle the breadth of the climate challenge and the opportunity if we map the intersections with housing policy and the intersection with racial justice and the intersection with public health. So this shift has been reflected in StopWaste's new aims and guiding principles, which were adopted in 2020. Under these aims, actions include assisting Alameda County jurisdictions to strategically and cost-effectively address regional and state level regulations and policies, including development of building code amendments that further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They use an equity lens when designing, implementing, and evaluating agency operations and programs. Continue an emphasis on upstream approaches for waste management, including waste reduction and switching to reusables. Form new and strengthen existing partnerships that expand our multiple benefits approach to include the social and economic health of our communities, acknowledging that we can't do it all on our own and are stronger if we work together. As well as reorient the agency's work where needed to respond to and rebuild from the impacts of COVID-19 and climate change. So this gets at the climate planning assistance that we provide to our cities and beyond, including some of our new work that we're doing with other community partners on how we can make sure that the economic recovery efforts after the pandemic are grounded in sustainable and green jobs. So now I want to transition to our panel of Alameda County sustainability staff to talk about how they're addressing climate action in this new paradigm. So first, we have Danielle from the City of Alameda.
Good evening, everyone. Happy Earth Day. I am pleased to be here to talk about the City of Alameda's Climate Action and Resilience Plan. Go ahead. And go to the next slide. So the city's Climate Action and Resilience Plan was adopted in 2019 and serves as a framework for the city's climate action and resilience plans going forward. And it really brings together many of the city's actions across departments and connects our greenhouse gas emissions efforts with our adaptation to natural hazards all in one plan. We also assess citywide vulnerabilities and set some ambitious targets and identify actions that are needed to address our climate vulnerabilities and build resilience. Next slide. One of the driving factors for creating this plan is the climate risk that Alameda faces. As a low-lying island and peninsula that's already at risk of shoreline flooding, Alameda is one of the most climate vulnerable cities in California. We face sea level rise, rising groundwater, extreme heat, hazardous air qualities, and other hazards exacerbated by climate change, which all threaten our quality of life and economy. So the Climate Action and Resilience Plan is designed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to these impacts and to adapt to the changing conditions that we will face. Next slide. The CARP lays out some specific actions that are needed in the following areas to achieve our ambitious goals of significantly reducing emissions and adapting to future conditions. These actions fall into 5 buckets, which include shifting our transportation to biking, walking, transit, avoiding our trips, and encouraging the use of EVs, reducing building energy, building all electric new buildings, electrifying appliances in existing buildings, and improving our energy efficiency. Sequestering carbon by cutting down carbon already in the atmosphere through planting trees and expanding wetlands and mulching, reducing the amount of waste that we send to the landfill and increasing our composting and recycling, and adapting to flooding, droughts, extreme heat, hazardous air quality, and the increasing risk of earthquakes and liquefaction from climate change. Equity cuts across all of our CARP goals and initiatives, and we recognize that certain populations in Alameda will bear the brunt of climate impacts and are less able to adapt or recover from emergencies. We need to make sure that equity is central when assessing the impacts of climate change, weighing our costs and benefits of proposed city actions, and prioritizing projects so that vulnerable residents see the benefits of things like shifting to EVs, electrifying appliances, home energy retrofits, tree planting, bike lanes, et cetera. It's really important that quality of life benefits go primarily and directly to those who have been most impacted by our systems historically. Next slide. Because Alameda Municipal Power is delivering 100% clean energy to all of Alameda as of 2020, our emissions are predominantly from the transportation sector, with another large chunk from the burning of natural gas in buildings for heating. So achieving significant emissions reductions in Alameda means reducing transportation and building heating is critical to meet our goals of GHG emissions of reducing our GHG emissions to 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. We are currently in the process in Alameda of developing an all-electric REACH code. So we would be requiring all new construction in Alameda to be all new residential and non-residential construction in Alameda to be built all electric with no gas hookups. And this expands on a 2019 resolution by City Council requiring all new development on city-owned land, which is a significant portion, nearly a third of the city, where most of the development has already been happening to be all electric. So we're expanding that to the rest of the city. Go to the next slide. I'm going to wrap up here, but looking forward to the discussion and hearing from the other cities as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Now we'll hear from Lizzie from the City of Albany. And I guess I forgot to say this in the beginning, after we do a brief overview of what each of the cities are doing right now, we're going to have a discussion on climate action.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Danielle. I'm Lizzie. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator with the City of Albany, and I'm going to give a brief overview of our Climate Action and Adaptation Plan in Albany. And I'm sure all our attendees will notice that many of our cities have very similar goals and actions and main themes, but all of us have small differences. But as a whole county, we're all on the same trend of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to climate change, and also make sure we're paying attention to ways we can enhance equity and create a just transition. Next slide, please. So in Albany, our city council adopted new greenhouse gas reduction goals along with adopting the 2019 Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. Those new goals are to have 70% greenhouse gas reductions by 2035 and 100% carbon neutrality by 2045. Noting that the way we defined carbon neutrality is even if at 2045 we can't get 100% of those emissions to be zeroed out, we want to ensure that we're also focusing on ways to sequester carbon to make sure that we're able to reduce emissions as much as possible, but also give ourselves a little wiggle room there until ideally we reach a point where we're carbon negative. We actually had a 25% emissions reduction goal by 2020, and we reached that. ahead of schedule with 33%, and that was in large part due to opting all energy accounts in Albany onto the 100% carbon neutral plan through EBCE. So if you are interested in having 100% carbon-free energy, I'd recommend checking out ebce.org. Next slide, please. In Albany, similar to a lot of Bay Area cities, our main emission sources are transportation and building energy use. And because we have 100% carbon-free energy now, most of that building energy use comes from natural gas, which we all know is not really natural and not really clean. So in the future, we need to focus on reducing emissions from these two sources in particular, and then also wherever else we're seeing emissions. This chart on the right shows what Albany's emissions profile is likely to look like if we take no action. So as you can see there, in 2045, we are not carbon neutral. If anything, we're only a small change from 2005. So this is demonstrating that swift action must be taken locally to reduce emissions, or we won't reach carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it's a climate action and adaptation plan, noting that combining those two approaches creates many co-benefits and makes sure that we're prepared for a resilient and equitable future. Next slide, please. Speaking of equity, we also wanted to make sure that equity ran through all themes of our climate action plan, and each action was analyzed for how it could potentially enhance equity or potential negatives that we need to make sure we pay attention to make sure we avoid in implementation of the climate action plan. So in our CAP, we defined equity or sustainability as the intersection of social equity, economic stability, and environmental quality, noting that all three themes are important, but making sure we really create an intersection of all, emphasizing equity. Next slide, please. So in our climate action and adaptation plan, we have 4 main chapters, as I like to call them, that focus on the 4 main themes, which are building electrification and also energy efficiency, low carbon transportation, creating a carbon-free economy, because even though the things we buy and eat and do within our city may not always count towards our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, every meal that we have and every t-shirt that we buy has greenhouse gas impacts that we want to make sure we are mitigating. And then also accelerating resilience for all. So both adapting to climate change and sequestering carbon. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. My contact information is here, so if you have further questions about our CAP, feel free to email me and we can cover them after the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. We're going in alphabetical order by city for who we have here. So up next is Rachel DeFranco from the city of Fremont.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Emily. So, quickly, I just wanted to give kind of a background about Fremont, because I think it helps set a stage for when we talk about how we can transition to a carbon neutral and post-carbon city. There's a lot going on. So, Fremont was incorporated in 1956 from 5 different townships and was primarily farmland at the time. And as we developed, we really developed in that model of a suburb with suburban sprawl as the central theme. So our current population is now 235,000 plus, and we're the 4th largest city in the Bay Area when it comes to population. And we're actually larger in size than the city of Oakland when it comes to geographic territory as well. We also like to think of ourselves as Silicon Valley East. Fremont is a hub for advanced manufacturing, clean technology, and biotech. And so we, are at the tail end of Alameda County and, butt up against a lot of the cities that are kind of thought of as quintessential Silicon Valley cities. Next slide, please. So, to kind of establish our sustainability and climate goals, we adopted our general plan that we're operating under right now in 2011, and actually put sustainability as the opening chapter and the central theme throughout that document. We established a vision within our general plan for Fremont to serve as a national model of how an auto-oriented suburb can evolve into a sustainable, strategically urban and modern city. And over the last decade, we have come to start realizing that with all of its growing pains associated. In 2012, we adopted our climate action plan, and that was, to really establish a roadmap for how to achieve the goals around sustainability that were envisioned in our general plan. So that first climate action plan established a goal for reducing our GHG emissions by 25% from a 2005 baseline, which was pretty standard for all the cities in Alameda County. And we actually have achieved that goal and slightly surpassed it at this point in time. So next slide, Emily. Now we're moving into our CAP 2.0 planning. So in the late winter of 2019, our Fremont City Council adopted a carbon neutrality resolution, which was recommended to them by our Sustainability Commission. And that carbon neutrality resolution set a target for the city of Fremont to become carbon neutral by the year 2045. Similar to what Lizzie said, we're looking at carbon neutrality as trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible. And then, if we can't zero it out completely, utilizing carbon sequestration through enhancements to the natural environment, especially looking at our urban forests to help with local sequestration as much as possible. We also set an interim target to achieve a 55% emission reduction by the year 2030. And within this resolution, put forth a post-carbon community framework, which is our guide for what we're doing with our climate action plan update now. And it establishes some overarching values and key strategies that I'll highlight next. So in terms of the post-carbon framework values, we put forth equity and access as one of the four, and that's really to ensure that all people in our community have the opportunity to benefit equally from climate solutions and that no one is taking on an unequal burden of the climate impacts that we're seeing. Efficiency and innovation is second, and that's really key to the city of Fremont, as I mentioned, with the type of economy that we have. We're really trying to promote the use of efficient resources and the adoption of clean and smart, climate smart technologies and techniques, especially those that are homegrown. Health and wellness is also central. We really want to ensure that we're safeguarding and enhancing the ability of our community to live, work, play, and thrive in a healthy social and physical environment. And then finally, resiliency and capacity building, really thinking about the education and training and the opportunities that are offered to our members of our community by a more resilient future, and really trying to encourage sustainable behaviors across all sectors of our community. Next slide. I think I mislabeled these. Values was supposed to be the last one. This is the strategies. So in terms of our strategies to how do we get to carbon neutral, there's really you'll hear this similarly from the other cities as well, and we may have phrased them slightly differently, but first and foremost, looking at clean and renewable power. So utilizing clean, renewable, as much as possible, locally sourced electricity that's generated on site or through the electricity grid that we can supply to our buildings and to our vehicles. The second is electrification and fossil fuel phase out. So really thinking about, as we continue to increase the amount of renewables, decreasing the amount of fossil fuels that we use, and replacing those appliances and processes that once use fossil fuels with electric ones. And that includes the transportation sector as well, so replacing gas burning vehicles with electric ones. Third is carbon sequestration, really, looking at how do we draw down that atmospheric carbon dioxide that we've already released through human activity, and bringing it back into a solid form through, ecological methods and sometimes technological methods, but primarily storing it in, plants, soils, water systems, in the forest. Fourth is mobility and connectivity. So really thinking about how do we develop and enhance a safe, multimodal, accessible, intelligent, clean, and equitable travel system, whether it's motorized or non-motorized, and looking also at different transit modes, transportation infrastructure, and community connectivity. This last year has taught us that we can connect without using a significant amount of carbon dioxide through virtual means, and still be able to achieve a lot of the goals we have. So looking toward technology as part of the solution here is essential. Fifth is resource conservation and elimination of waste, really making sure that we're aiming toward that goal of zero waste by conserving natural and manufactured resources through responsible production, consumption, reuse, and recovery of products and materials. The second to last is what I've termed restorative ecology and green infrastructure, really thinking about like restoring and rehabilitating any ecosystems that might have been degraded or damaged over time through development, and then and really using active interventions to do that, and then also incorporating green infrastructure and ecosystem services into community design. So really developing in concert with nature as we move forward. And then finally, climate adaptation and resilience, really preparing for limiting, learning from, and then adapting to the negative effects of climate change through proactive planning, and really looking at that at kind of all of the infrastructural, cultural, and institutional levels. So these are the frameworks that we're going into our climate action plan update. And I'm happy to talk about some of the ways in which we have pursued our CAP update process as we get into the discussion.
Thanks, Rachel. Last up before we get into our discussion is Megan Campbell from the City of Pleasanton.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Emily, so much for having me. It's good to see you all. So my name is Megan, and I work in the Community Development Department with the City of Pleasanton. So you can go to the next slide. In Pleasanton, we have an existing climate action plan. It was adopted in 2012, and the horizon year of that plan was 2020. So it's a city council priority to get a new plan adopted. So we're currently in the process of updating our CAP. And so instead of focusing on actions that we're taking right now, I'll sort of focus on what our process has been throughout the update, and get into that a little bit. So with the new plan, we hope to respond to new regulations, strategies, and technologies similar to what you've heard in the last few presentations. We want to protect the health and well-being of our residents and local economy, and we want to create a clear strategy forward that addresses emissions, but also resilience and adaptation. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. We kicked off the project right around March of 2020, and so it's definitely been a unique time to be updating a policy document. We've really had to pivot our community engagement strategy. Normally we host a booth at farmers market and we go to the senior center, and instead we've all become, accustomed to these video calls and virtual engagement. So we created a robust website with climate trivia, videos that were created by the local high schools, surveys, digital poster boards, and then we've held some digital community workshops, public hearings, use social media a lot more than I think we were anticipating needing to rely on it. Gotten into the Pleasanton Weekly and TV 30, put mailers in everybody's utility bills, just really trying to get creative with how we're connecting with people. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. So after we reimagined our process, we were able to really get into that climate work. And we took a look first at our existing conditions, which included a climate vulnerability assessment for the city, which looked at climate science scenarios and the biophysical impacts that we'd actually face in our city, like drought and wildfire, and then outlined opportunities to enhance climate resilience across the city. We also reviewed our emissions, and as you've seen in the other cities before me, I bet you can guess where our biggest emissions come from, and it's transportation, number one, and then number two is buildings and energy. We forecasted out future emissions and then set emission reduction targets, and our long-term target is also carbon neutrality by 2045 per capita for us. We've completed a number of the document framework actions. So we created, for example, the overarching goal for the document and things like that. And then we've also developed a really long list of potential actions that we may consider and to reduce our emissions. And we created that list by talking with the community, the residents and the businesses, commissions, committees, and implementation partners like StopWaste. They've been a great resource for us. Looking at best practices and plans recently adopted by other cities like Albany and Alameda, and then connecting with other cities who are currently going through the climate planning process like Fremont. And then just last night, we had a Committee on Energy and Environment public hearing where the committee recommended to reduce, this big long list of actions into a slightly more manageable list, though still a little longer than it will ultimately end up being. And this slightly smaller list, we plan on putting through a quantitative, cost benefit analysis to really try to drill down what are going to be the actions that really move the needle in a meaningful way for the city. So that's really high level where we're at. I know we want to get into the discussion here with the group. So, I'll be speaking from the perspective of as we've been updating our plan, what we've been seeing and what the conversations that we've been having in the community are. And then if you're interested in learning more about our climate action plan and following along with our update process, we have a website, cityofpleasantonca.gov/cap. There's a place to sign up for updates there. And then you would be notified about all meetings and ways to stay involved in our process. So I think I'll end it there and we can get into our discussion and dive into the details a little bit more.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I think that's a great overview. If you have any questions for our panelists, like I said, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. We have some preset questions that we can get to get us started. I think the biggest question, was probably, people have heard it before, but it's on all of our minds, is how has 2020, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a social justice uprising, severe wildfires, and therefore air quality effects in the Bay Area. How have all of those things, or one of those things, affected your climate work? Who wants to go first? I'll always call on someone.
I can jump in. I'll just kick us off by saying 2020 has been a really demanding year for priorities across the city. And there's been, a lot of things that have come up that have required immediate attention from our cities. And these priorities have a really strong connection to a lot of the work that we're doing, from a climate standpoint. And things that we have heard a lot as we've been updating our climate action plan are about economic recovery and wildfire resilience and grid resilience and equity. And I think that we've been able to really weave these things into our plan as we've been going through the update process. So I'll start us off there and see what everyone else has to say.
I can add to that. I have a little bit of a unique perspective in Alameda in that I actually started this job in 2021. And actually this position was created in 2021. So I think there was, real kudos to the city council who continued to, initially the position was put on hold in the beginning of the pandemic. And then as it progressed, they did, continue to decide to fund the position, which I think was a real credit to them in recognizing that this is a long-term priority of the city. And one that really deserved the full attention of a full-time staff person. And I think that the pandemic has really, while it has certainly challenged budgets, it's challenged our engagement efforts, and it's challenged just so much of what we're doing and trying to accomplish in so many ways. I think it's also really afforded an opportunity for us to, as we are in so much of our lives, just sort of rethinking how we go about doing our business, and really has contributed to a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of all of these aspects of our life. And I think as the quote that Emily started off at the beginning, that it really I think pushes us to not just be counting carbon emissions, but to really see how our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are directly connected to improving public health, to improving the economy, to creating green jobs, to improving equity, to making the cities in which we work more livable, more enjoyable places to be, and to really ensure that we secure our future, and that our future is strong. And so in a lot of ways, it's so much has been so challenging in the last year, but I'm really optimistic in a lot of ways and hopeful at the new ways of doing our work and the new ways in which we're thinking about things. I think there's some exciting opportunities.
Yeah, I'll just add, what's really interesting is the framework for sustainability is the trifecta of, you can call it people, planet, profit, or, equity, environment, and the economy. And, we have, as sustainability practitioners, really, taken that on as our rallying cry for the work that we do. We want to protect the environment as much as possible for the people and for the prosperity of the people that are living on this planet. So we're trying to conserve resources so that we still have resources to, be able to utilize to be able to grow and thrive as a community. So, the events of 2020 have been, extreme and one after the other, and have really demanded attention from our city leadership in ways that has, been all encompassing. And it's hard sometimes to take a step back and see the larger picture, but, sustainability can continue to be, the way in which we move forward. And we've seen that now under the new federal administration, that, as we look toward rebuilding our economy and recovering from the impacts of COVID and other, issues that we've seen in our communities, whether it's social or environmental, that we are really looking at a framework of how do we do this in a sustainable fashion moving forward.
Right, and similar to what everyone else has said very well, I think I was chatting with a colleague yesterday about this, about how I think 2020 made a lot of us take a step back and reflect about what our values are, where we want to see the world we live in moving towards, and how we can make a difference in our communities. And I think one thing that I really enjoy about being in local government is not only as staff and as elected officials and appointed officials, not only do we have a role in helping to create some change, but we're also, in the way we do things, able to uplift voices or provide space for actual members of the community who our work affects to hopefully say how they feel and give us their ideas. And our goal as staff and as city officials is always to make sure that the community directs the work that we're doing. And so I think that's a really big piece too, moving forward, is making sure the community is involved to create community goals and community plans so that we can create a sustainable, with the trifecta of needs, sustainable future.
Yeah, and along those lines, you were saying a lot has allowed us to step back and also sort of reimagine what moving forward looks like. As we talk about adaptation and resilience, sometimes those things take really big shifts in behavior, and COVID has forced us to change, and some of those changes may be positive and may stick around, as we move forward.
Yeah, that leads into another good question. And then after that, I'll get into the chat, but this is like a, a really good one to come next, about what do we think implementation of these climate action plans or climate goals is going to look like as we open up. What do you think are some of the biggest opportunities or things that we want to, keep the same or keep going, things that we hope will not return to normal, but return to some sort of new state that is better than how things were in 2019?
I think in Alameda, in our climate action and resilience plan, we had a strategy to encourage telecommuting that is now done and hopefully sticks around for the long term. I think that really allows us to reimagine transportation and commuting, and as an island with limited egress options, and constant calls sort of to rethink our connection to the mainland. I think that maybe just shifts the conversation a little bit for us. And then along with that, I think it's really afforded us the opportunity to rethink our local transportation network. And there's been a number of significant sort of bike infrastructure projects that have been in the works for a number of years. And we really, for now see the real benefit of that type of work. And, we've been able to play with some things during the pandemic. We closed a number of streets in town to cars and traffic to allow bikes and pedestrians, and people have really enjoyed it and are asking for some of that to stay permanent. So we're thinking about, how do we make that permanent? We've striped new bike lanes. We've actually narrowed the traffic going through our downtown streets so that we could make more room for parklets in the street, so we could make more room for bikes and pedestrians. And I think, we're in the phase where we're talking about what parts of those things do we want to make permanent, what parts do we like, what parts are maybe going to be not so permanent. But there's some really great public gathering spaces that have been created in the last year that didn't exist before. And I think some of these changes people are finding are really, really enjoyable, and they're making our quality of life better. And so I think, the way that our parks have been utilized and our beaches in Alameda, I think there's just huge opportunity for us to sort of rethink the fabric of our city in a lot of new, exciting ways.
Danielle, you hit on a lot of them. One of the things that I would add is energy resiliency. And I think that, what we have seen over the last handful of years, but especially, I think it affected people more substantially this past year because we were all sheltered in place at home, was, the wildfires and the impacts of the public safety power shutdowns that PG&E has been holding multiple times a year now. And in the city of Fremont a couple of years ago, prior to PSPS events, we partnered with a local clean tech firm to install microgrids on a few of our fire station facilities. And it was the first project where microgrids went into critical city facilities, I think, in the state. But it's really served as an example of how do we think differently about how we utilize energy at our facilities, and how we think about planning for emergency services with resiliency as the key focus. And so those systems we have solar plus a battery backup system and a microgrid controller, which is kind of the brains behind it, so that if there's an outage, those facilities have power that is coming directly from that stored battery energy and from the solar that supports it. And the diesel generators that we used to have on site, are still there, but they're a secondary backup. And eventually we want to be able to retire those completely. So that would be the one thing I would add.
I also think one thing I often think about is that as much as we as cities can put into our plans actions that we will aim to do to reduce emissions, there's such a huge role that individual households and families and individual people have to play in reducing emissions within our cities. To ultimately reach carbon neutrality, we have to have it at the city level and also the community level. And I think what 2020 taught us, and what we have learned from it, hopefully, and will carry forward, is that individuals can make change, right? I think one of the things at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was that individuals need to slow the spread. We need to make sure we're protecting our communities. And I think that's something that moving forward, we can think about how can individuals be empowered to make shifts in their life to help reduce emissions and to make a more sustainable community. And so that's something where I think in terms of climate action, if we can develop as cities programs for individuals to take individual level climate action, those individuals knowing that they can make a difference and can make it or should make a difference moving forward, will also help in reaching these climate goals.
I think you all hit on most of them. I'll just elaborate a little bit on some of the stuff that I've heard, but I think we've really seen how we can use our public space differently, our right of ways, and how, I think Danielle mentioned that they were closing some of their streets to cars during this. So did we. We closed our main street. We've also allowed on weekends during the summer. We've also allowed, some of the parking spaces to be used for dining and for, businesses to sort of spill out into this right of way. And, parking has always been kind of a hot topic and something we never seem to have enough of. But throughout COVID, we've allowed the right of way to really transform, and it's created a vibrancy and a vitality on the streets. And I don't know in what form that will stay and what form it won't, but currently we don't have a parklet program in Pleasanton, and perhaps that's something we see in the future. And we encourage people to come downtown in a more active mode, and we're able to use our right of way in a slightly different way than we've done in the past.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about if there's been any consideration of limiting the size of single family homes. So you all discussed how a huge portion of our emissions are from residential units. I have a background in planning and used to work at a planning department in one of the cities of Alameda County. There's some things in check, like floor area ratio limits or setbacks that keep houses in check a little bit. But we do still have some pretty large homes. So how have you thought about reimagining what single family homes or single family zoning might look like as a means to reduce carbon emissions?
That's a tough question. We're sustainability practitioners and not the planning managers. So if you were to ask that question to them, you might get a different response. But like we haven't set a limit specifically on single family homes. But like you said, Emily, there's ways in which through residential zoning, we kind of create limits and ratios of how large things can be. One of the things that I think might be worth sharing here is a couple years back that as we were reviewing our residential zoning guidelines and design, residential design guidelines, we were posed with the question around solar access by a resident who lived in a neighborhood where there were, mega homes being built, which is, somebody who came in, bought a single story, single family home, and then added a second story addition that, felt kind of out of community character. But one of the concerns was, is that going to shade the roof of my home as the next door neighbor so that I don't have access to, putting solar on my roof anymore for clean power. So we actually incorporated that into our residential design guidelines to say that you have to demonstrate that you're preserving the solar access of your neighbors when you do that second story addition.
I didn't know that, but that's really interesting, Rachel. Thank you for sharing. In Albany, we are a very dense urban environment. And actually, I think I heard today that we've only had one completely new home, like actual new home built from the ground built in Albany in the last 5 years. It's mainly remodels of existing structures. But, and like Rachel mentioned, I'm in the community development department and I am a planner, but I don't actually do any design review or a lot of the home or zoning planning. But I do know that our city council and our planning zoning commission and our climate action committee is talking about how we can think about how we use space, how we incorporate mixed use in our commercial corridors. So perhaps having commercial on the bottom level and residential on the top to build up instead of out, because we only have little spaces at this point. So it's getting creative about what we currently have and how we can adapt it in the spirit of climate change to fit our future needs, which includes a growing population. And in addition to thinking through how we can change the structure of what our homes look like, it's also, as you've heard here before, thinking through how we can use local resources, local transportation networks, local energy resources to make sure that we are transforming the way we think of the home.
Alameda is a similar built out urban environment to Albany. So we are not constructing new single family homes. I'm sure we haven't in years. But we do have a former Navy base, which is a third of the land mass of the island, which is undergoing complete redevelopment. And there is a large number of multifamily homes being built on that base. So that is the way that we are, primarily the way that we're growing right now is through the multifamily development, and that is pretty greenfield development. And so the conversation that we are now having is in these sort of built out urban environments where we can find opportunities in lots in the already built out part of the island where there are opportunities for multifamily housing within a neighborhood that is primarily single family housing. And I think that is sort of our big challenge and a tough conversation to have, but where we really ultimately I think need to be building out and finding those spaces and those sort of empty lots or underutilized lots in town where we can sort of have density on a small scale that fits in an environment that's primarily single family homes.
I'll just add, in a prior city that I worked for in Contra Costa, we did do a study on a maximum house size limit essentially, and went through this whole study, and at the end of the day didn't adopt it because, you know, we found that it was a little bit too restrictive to having an absolute, and it varies by lot, you know, based on the lot's characteristics and the slope and the trees and, you know, the size of the lot. And so I think what you'll see is a lot of cities have, you know, floor area ratios, which, you know, are a percentage of the lot size and do have a maximum, but it's based more on the lot size and the location that it is. And certain districts are going to allow slightly larger homes, and certain districts are going to allow, you know, a more dense setting and smaller homes and smaller lots. But along the lines of what everyone else was saying, you know, focusing on, you know, a lot of transit oriented development, you know, things that are near BART, and figuring out where the right development can be located within the city. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Pleasanton and Fremont have a lot more ability to add more units than I think Albany and Alameda. You know, in Fremont over the last, you know, housing element cycle, we've added over 6,000 units, and under the next cycle, you know, our regional housing needs allocation is over 15,000 units. You know, so looking at, you know, how are we going to continue to increase the density is a huge question. A lot of the units that have gone on, I mean, we're still building single family homes, but we have built a lot more multifamily, you know, higher density. We have 4 transit oriented development overlays in our general plan. You know, and one of the other things that I wanted to add is that at the statewide level, the state streamlined accessory dwelling units known as ADUs. So, you know, all cities had to really go through and review you know, the processes for allowing ADUs and the fees that we charge for those ADUs to really support the ability for people to add those accessory dwelling units, which, you know, are often referred to as in-law units, so that in those existing single family homes that might have been built in the 60s and 70s that have much larger lots, we can start to increase density as well.
Yeah, there's also been a lot of reach codes that have been passed throughout the state of California, some in Alameda County, and might be, you know, more and more as time goes on, that have mandated that all new construction be all electric, which, as you've seen, you know, the portion of our greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to electricity in buildings is just shrinking as our grid gets cleaner and cleaner. So while that doesn't necessarily impact the resource efficiency overall of building perhaps really large homes, it's at least doing quite a bit to cut down on their ongoing greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, it's oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Rachel.
I just wanted to add one more thing that I recently had a conversation with our housing manager about too, and that's that as we've been looking at, you know, the housing that we're putting in, and especially for affordable housing, multifamily housing, we've actually increased the number of rooms in those units, and that's really because we have multi-generational families living in Fremont very significantly. And so, you know, thinking about limiting the square footage of a property isn't necessarily getting at that use of resource efficiency per person either, and thinking about how do we how do we house our community moving forward? We have a lot of families where, you've got the grandparents and you've got aunts and uncles all living under the same household.
Yeah, and in certain cities like the city of Berkeley, which has kind of gone done away with in some ways with single family zoning. I mean, you can still have an existing single family house, but it just permits multi-unit dwellings to be built on what was previously a single family lot. So there will still be plenty of single family housing in Berkeley for decades to come. But you are seeing things like that where we are getting perhaps more flexible, and then if you did have a really big home, I mean, look at a bunch of the homes in San Francisco that are multi-unit out of what used to be a single family home. So I do think that the density of what our cities look like are going to change as we have to adjust to population growth, where while on some of our edge cities in Alameda County or in California, like Fremont and Pleasanton have a lot to build. Probably a lot of our cities right now are very dense and built out. And so it is those creative kinds of solutions. Well, as I said, the hour is going to go real fast. It looks like there's an Alameda municipal power question in the chat. Danielle, if you are able to maybe answer that in the chat. So that person can get their answer. But I did want to close out by just going back to this theme about how climate action, connects to everything. And so to maybe just give a minute or two on where you are starting to see how your city might be having these conversations in other departments, that it's no longer just sustainability staff, or kind of where you really see the biggest opportunities for climate to get at what a lot of us have talked about, to create a more to do more than just perpetuate our current cities just with less greenhouse gas emissions, versus looking at the interconnectedness to really create a more vibrant and equitable future.
I can start, and this is something that I've been thinking about and talking about for a while. And it's really about how do we integrate sustainability into how we do business across all departments in a city. So I look at it as kind of institutionalizing and mainstreaming sustainability. And a lot of us are either the sole sustainability staff person in our city, or one of a very small team. And we typically don't have much of anything of a budget to speak of to implement our projects. But what we do is we coordinate across departments. And I think as our roles have matured and as our cities have understood the benefits of our work and implementing our climate action plans, we've really started to look at how do we integrate sustainability into the other things that we're doing. And so in Fremont, we're not only updating our climate action plan, we're doing a parks master plan, we're doing an urban forestry management plan, we're doing a trails plan. We have a lot of things going on right now. We have a housing element update, and we are all talking to each other to understand how to integrate in the goals of the other plans into our plans. And I think that is, one of the huge achievements of our practice over the last handful of years, and is also reflected in the funding that's coming down from the federal level, looking at infrastructure that supports our economic recovery goals, that supports our sustainable development goals, that supports our social equity goals in one package.
I was just going to say, Rachel, you said that beautifully. I think we try to coordinate sustainability among everything else that's happening in our cities, and that sustainability definition, again, thinking at a more holistic view of the definition of sustainability. And I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but for all those listening, again, when we hear our community members come to city council meetings or to committee or commission meetings and also reinforce that it's a community value to have sustainability woven into city practices, that makes our jobs a lot easier, because we get to provide those resources to the community to be more sustainable, and then the community can continue to be involved and show that that's a value.
Yeah, you summed it up really well, Rachel. But you know, as I'll speak from as we're updating our climate action plan standpoint, you know, it hasn't been just me in a room, you know, working with the consultant to try to create our plan. You know, we've really been working with every single department and division within the city, and you know, everything that we're talking about, it really does touch every bit of operations. You know, we have actions about park management, and we have actions about for our operations staff and how our buildings run, and actions that relate to planning and development. You know, we were just talking about home size and density and things like that, and with engineering and CIP projects, and it really does touch every piece of the city. So, you know, as we update our plans and then as we implement our plans, you know, it really is a city-wide effort. And so, you know, we all are working with the entire city and with the entire community to try to get these actions achieved.
Danielle, anything else to add?
Nothing else for me.
Okay, well, look at that. It's exactly 8. We didn't even get through all the preset questions we had, but I really appreciate all of you joining from, yeah, again, we have 14 cities in the unincorporated county in Alameda, and it's a very, very diverse city, or diverse county, you know, ranging from Oakland, again, out to Fremont, and then, you know, some of our smaller cities as well, like Newark and Union City that get, you know, forgotten about here and there. And a lot of residential cities and a lot of cities that have industry, you know, the port. So there's a lot going on here, and we really have been a leader in the climate space. And while we have, as Rachel referred to, kind of very small departments working on this, there's just so much momentum behind it. And we couldn't do all this work without all of the residents as well. So thank you for all the attendees for being here. And if you have other questions, I'll drop my contact information in the chat, because if you are here from a different city and you're like, what's my city doing? I can put you in touch with the person from your city, or if you just have additional follow-up questions about StopWaste or anything that we talked about today. Thank you very much. And I hope you all have a good evening and the rest of your Earth Day.
Happy
Good evening, everyone. Happy Earth Day.